So, this is part two of our Romeo and Juliet lecture. And specifically, we've been talking about how Shakespeare presents love in the play. And so, if you've watched part one of the video, you'll notice that I've mentioned that Act 2, Scene 6 is where Friar Laurence he ties the knot between Romeo and Juliet. Um, and as such, obviously, very much catalyzes what happens in the rest of this play. And so Friar Laurence is a rather interesting character, and he occupies a somewhat curious place in the play, in a way because he embodies this sort of moral tension, this sort of moral catch-22, if you will, in the play. Because on the one hand, he empathizes with the young lovers, right? He empathizes with the passion and the purity of their love, and so he facilitates the union between the lovers. But by doing so, he also accelerates the tragic ending of their lives, right? And it's not just their lives, but obviously, the tragic telos of this play, right? And adding to the fact that he is a religious man, there is an added sort of tension and complexity in perhaps the way we as the audience or readers would respond to his role. And so by the end of Act 2, Scene 6, Friar Laurence, obviously, he ties the knot for Romeo and Juliet, but not before he cautions Romeo about this need for restraint in love, right? And this is actually good advice, I think, for everyone. Going back to what I said about Romeo and Juliet being such a timeless and universal play, and because, everyone really does need to exercise a certain amount of restraint in love, right? And so Friar Laurence begins by saying, "Oh, so smile the heavens upon this holy act," obviously being, the marriage, "that after hours with sorrow chide us not." So he's saying, "Oh, please, heavens, God, please bless this marriage, right? And don't penalize us after this is done." And Romeo responds, obviously, in a state of excitement, as we can see from this rhetorical flourish. "Amen, amen, but come what sorrow can, it cannot countervail the exchange of joy that one short minute gives me in her sight. Do thou but close our hands with holy words, then love devouring death do what he dare. It is enough I may but call her mine." And so it's very characteristic Romeo speech, right? It's very bombastic. And so this character, Romeo, he claims that, no amount of sorrow can undercut the sheer amount of joy that I feel just from looking at Juliet, right? And he even goes so far as to kind of challenge death, right? To do what he dare, because he's saying, well, as long as I've married Juliet, as long as I have her in my possession, it's enough, right? That's it. That's all I want out of living. And this is obviously a very remarkable moment of dramatic irony, especially because we know from the opening chorus of this play that eventually this pair of star-crossed lovers will take their life, right? This is what we see in the very beginning of the play. And so we know that already, actually. We know that about Romeo and Juliet. And so for him to say this, for him to say, "Love devouring death, do what he dare," obviously at this moment we're going to think, and it will. And so Friar Laurence, obviously, he then compounds this irony, right? Because he says, "Oh man, steady on, Romeo," because he says, "These violent delights have violent ends, and in their triumph die, like fire and powder, which as they kiss consume. The sweetest honey is loathsome in his own deliciousness, and in the taste confounds the appetite. Therefore love moderately, long love doth so. Too swift arrives as tardy as too slow. And so we call this this style of speaking sententiae. And so it's a kind of almost like a moralizing kind of speech, and it rather suits, Friar Laurence role, right? And so he's saying here, well, hold on, because actually the best sort of love is the kind of love that really lasts, right? And it's just not meant to be the stuff of sparks and fireworks all the time. That's not how love should be. And so he alludes to Aristotle's theory of the golden mean here, right? When he's saying that nothing should be pursued in excess, right? And that obviously includes love, because anything gained too much too quickly will most likely meet bad ends. And so what's interesting rhetorically is the first line. These violent delights have violent ends. And we see the use of antinaclasis here. And antinaclasis refers to the repetition of a word where the second occurrence of the word carries a different meaning from the first, right? So obviously then in this line, the word is violent. And so the first violent is a good sort of violence, referring to passion, right? The passion of love. But the second violent, albeit being the same word, being the same adjective, is the bad sort of violence, right? And sort of violence that ends in bloodshed and death, right? And obviously we've seen many examples of lovers in history or in literature dying for love, dying in the name of love, but obviously, that always ends in tragedy. Insofar as we see death as a reflection of tragedy, there are other ways of looking at death. It's rather morbid. So in any case, going back to what Friar Laurence was saying, he's basically saying, just never stretch love to its extreme, right? And he cautions this in a metaphor when he says, the sweetest honey is loathsome in his own deliciousness, and in the taste confounds the appetite. So he compares love to honey here, right? And he's saying, well, even for something as pleasant to the palate as honey, too much of it is just going to gross you out, right? It's just going to be loathsome. It's just going to be, even when in its nature it is a delicious thing. And he's saying, if we taste too much of a good thing, then really it's just going to confound the appetite. It's just going to confuse us, right? So he's really saying too much of a good thing is just going to be bad. As paradoxical as that sounds, but it's true, and we know it's true. And then he follows that with an injunction, right, for Romeo to love moderately, long love doth so. And so perhaps if you've watched part one, some of you would have been able to pick up, the example of love here as a case of polyptoton, right? Polyptoton, which, if you remember, is the repetition of a word in different parts of speech, right? So it changes from being a verb in the first clause, love moderately, to being a noun in the second clause, long love, which basically means long-lasting, durable love, right? And so perhaps Friar Laurence here, by shifting this word love from being a verb to a noun, he's, suggesting the need for Romeo to just move away from this restless loving, from his intense but restless and reckless loving, to a calmer state, Indeed, to a state. And, we all know that the part of speech that conveys the state of something is the noun, right? And so he's saying, just, be content with just simply being in love, right? And then just one more rhetorical device to look at here is in the use of antithesis. And we see that in the antithetical phrases, scrolling back up, in the last line of what I just read, too swift arrives as tardy as too slow. So clearly the pair of antithesis we see here is too swift and too slow, right? But what is he saying here? He's saying too swift is actually just as bad as too slow, right? And it's interesting, for Shakespeare to place these opposite phrases at the beginning and the end of the line, because in a way it almost cancels out their inherently contrasting nature, right? And at the same time, it's basically saying, well, yes, they're equally bad, right? Too swift, too slow, equally bad, but also emphasizes this idea of balance, right? Which is very much central to Friar Laurence's message to Romeo about love. But of course, we know Friar Laurence is preaching to the choir here, especially when it comes to Romeo, because that's the whole thing about Romeo and his worldview about loving, right? About love, is that he just doesn't care about love being long. He doesn't care about it. To him, it is all about the intensity of the moment, right? The intensity of the moment and the authenticity of his emotions, right? And in a way, he's almost kind of like a proto-Baudelaire, and Baudelaire here refers to Charles Baudelaire, the French poet at the end of the 19th century, the fin du siècle of the 19th century, whose the Baudelairean ethos is very much about just living for the intensity of the moment, right? And to hell with the rest of it. And so here he's saying, as long as I'm able to call Juliet mine, I am happy and ready and willing to die, right? There you go. That's Act 2, Scene 6.